How do we handle grief as believers? How do we mourn with those who mourn? Welcome to Grace and Truth. My name is Owen Strachan, and I will be your host. I am joined today by Erik Reed, who is the founder and lead pastor of the Journey Church in Lebanon, Tennessee, a little bit east of Nashville. He is a trusted voice in the evangelical and Reformed communities. He's a strong pastor. He started a great work called Knowing Jesus, I believe, and just a brother I pray we can learn from. So, Erik, welcome to Grace and Truth.
Owen, thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction and just for the invitation to be here. Thankful for you.
Well, it's a joy to have you. We were talking a minute ago and saying that our paths have almost crossed in a lot of different places. I was at Southern Seminary in a season. You were there in a different season. And anyway, here we are talking. So
that's right.
That's good. So Merry Christmas to you. By the way, I violated pastor code because I've asked Erik in the midst of, I'm sure, 8 million things in Christmas season to come on my podcast. So thank you, by the way, for that as well, Erik.
Yeah, that's right. Happy to.
He's probably fitting me in the midst of all sorts of stuff going on.
No, it's good. It's worth it. These are great conversations that are worth having.
Well, I wanted to talk with you, Erik, because you've been open on social media. I'm sure a number of folks who are listening to this and watching this follow you on social media. And I very much encourage that. Erik Reed on Twitter and other platforms. And you've talked about losing your son, Caleb. I believe you lost him in 2019. You have a lot to share and a lot to minister beyond this story. But it does strike me from afar as if, God has brought this in your life
Yep.
to bless others and help others, among other effects. Can you just talk to us about the background, the backdrop with Caleb and being a father? You have 3 kids, including him. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, so Caleb was our first child. So when we were 23 years old, having our first child, we learned that Caleb had some medical issues when he was still in the womb. And they did some testing. They discovered that he had a kidney, just one of his 2, that had cysts all over it. And it was creating some issues for him and for my wife's pregnancy. He ended up being born 10 weeks premature and a few months in the hospital where they were draining those cysts, trying to get him bigger and stronger so that they could have a surgery to remove that bad kidney. So the goal was get the bad kidney out, and then he could leave the hospital, live with one strong functioning kidney and never have any issues. A lot of people only have one kidney and can live perfectly normal lives, except for when they did the surgery, there was a surgical mistake and they took both of his kidneys on accident. And so he had something called horseshoed kidneys, which means they were connected together. And they were also folded like this. And so if you could imagine 2 kidneys, each the size of a thumbnail, being connected together and then closed in on each other, when they went in to take that bad kidney, that's all they could see from the side was the kidney with cyst on it. They took it out and they discovered that the good kidney had been taken with it. And that threw our lives upside down. From that point on, obviously, he was in need of a kidney transplant. He was a teeny tiny little baby, and they don't do teeny tiny baby kidneys to other baby kidneys. You have to have an adult kidney, which means he had to get bigger. And we had to do a lot of waiting and a lot of hospital visits and a lot of dialysis. And so for 2 years, that's what we did. We did dialysis. We made trips to the hospital 3 to 4 times a week. Of course, he dealt with side effects from this and all kinds of other things. But after 2 years, he finally received a kidney transplant from my wife, and which is a whole nother incredible story. But from that point on, Caleb lived with a kidney. He took a lot of medication to keep that kidney from rejecting, and the immune system naturally is built to reject foreign bodies inside of it. So he had to do a lot of things to keep his kidney functioning and healthy, and that worked great. But it also made him very susceptible to a lot of other types of infections that you and I, our bodies would just reject it pretty fast. So from the time Caleb was 2 to the time he was 13, and we can pick back up the story in a little bit if you want to. He lived a fairly normal life. For us, it became normal, but he had a lot of different medical issues. We spent time at the hospital a lot. He would easily get sick. But for us, compared to that first 2 years, it was more normal than we had experienced. So I would say this, those first 2 years, though, Owen, the Lord really was teaching us and breaking down some preconceived ideas and notions and bad theology, and forced us to develop a biblical theology of suffering by necessity. Trying to ask questions, where is God in this? And how do we make sense of this? And we were young. We were, maybe a little bit predisposed to an idea that says if you're seeking to obey the Lord and you love the Lord, then, things like this aren't supposed to happen to you. I don't think we would have had a full-blown prosperity gospel, but we had some seeds of it there, because our expectation is God was supposed to not let this happen. And so that obviously confronted us with, what does the Bible actually say about suffering? And so, yeah, that's a little bit of the background of how we kind of got thrust into this kind of world.
Wow. I'm moved to my core just already hearing this part, and I thank you for sharing it. I know you've shared it elsewhere, of course, but I thank you for sharing it again for the edification of those watching and listening. It does strike me that a lot of us operate with that kind of low-level prosperity theology, and there are Bible verses that if we read them a certain way, maybe not optimally as they're supposed to be read. I'm not saying we're expecting, a gold Lamborghini in the driveway tomorrow morning.
That's right.
But we do kind of think, God, I'm following you, I'm going hard, and so you're going to hold your end of the bargain, and things are supposed to go pretty good for me. And then trial hits, and not just a trial of 6 hours, but a sustained trial. Did you and your wife, please give me your wife's name as well when you can.
Katrina,
Katrina. Did you and Katrina face challenges and battles to hold on to the goodness of the character of God in that season, or no?
Yeah. So I remember the day after the surgical mistake had happened, my wife was so devastated, she couldn't even go into his room. She couldn't even go into the hospital room. And I remember being in there with my Bible in hand, a notebook in hand, and my son hooked up to all these machines, fighting for his life. And everything I had thought I understood about my relationship with the Lord, about suffering, about why is this happening to us, it was kind of all stripped down. And I remember just desperately saying, God, I just need to hear from you. Like, as a man, as a husband, as a father, how am I supposed to lead through this? And I didn't have a theological education at this point. I was still, I had been in the Army for 4 years. So it was not until after the Army that I even went and did any undergraduate work. And I was pastoring before I even had an undergraduate degree. So my theology formally didn't come till later. But I was forced at this point to have to do some theological work to understand what's happening. And so I'll never forget this. I was just going through my Bible. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know where to turn, but I knew I was needing something. And I got to the story of Daniel. And the only thing I really knew about the story of Daniel was Daniel in the lion's den. At that point, that was about the extent of my Sunday school memory. And as I started going through Daniel 1, I was struck like to the heart about when the Lord gave over Israel to Nebuchadnezzar. And it said that he came and he conquered, and he took those 3 Hebrew boys and he sent them off away from their families, away from their land, away from their language, away from their culture. And I remember reading that and feeling like that must have felt like the world got turned upside down for them. The God that they had read about their whole life, the stories that had been told about how God had given them victory over larger armies and greater nations, and the miracles that God had performed. They knew those things. And now here comes the Babylonians, and they crushed them. And they had to feel very disoriented. And then they got plucked from everything they knew and sent away. And I just really resonated with that in that moment because I felt upside down. I felt like everything I thought I knew was upside down and crushed and undone. And as I kept reading that story, and I didn't know anything about what was going to happen. It was like front page news to me. I was like, whoa, what happened next? And then I see the incredible face off that they have with Nebuchadnezzar in the fiery furnace. And what struck me and the way the Lord spoke to me in that moment was their response to Nebuchadnezzar's threats. And they said, be it known to you, King, that our God, whom we serve, is able to save us. And I remember reading that and thinking, okay, there's hope here. Like our God, is the arm of the Lord shortened? By no means. Our God can save. Our God can rescue. And in that moment, like I really needed that. I really wanted that. But here's what got me is that's not where it stopped. And in verse 18 of Daniel 3, they say, but even if he doesn't, or some translations say, but if not. And I didn't know what to do with that. I didn't know what to do with the theology of these three young men saying our God is able to save us and rescue us. He has all the power to do it. And yet it's in his prerogative that he might not do it. And we're still going to worship him and not bow down. And I was just flabbergasted. I did not know that kind of theology. A theology that says it's God's prerogative to rescue or not. He can, but he may want you to go through it, and that may be his will. And will you still worship him? And Owen, I remember just writing down notes from that. I had never preached a sermon at this point. This was not sermon prep. This was like survival. This is how am I going to talk to my wife about what we're to do, how we're to think about this. And I spent a few hours that day reading that story, reflecting. I remember going back into the room where my wife was and talking to her about the moment I just had with God. And it didn't magically fix anything, but here's what it started to do is it started shaping our perspective. And it started helping us to seek God in a way that said, even if you don't remove us from this, will you sustain us through this? Will you be near to us in this furnace? Will you let this be for your glory, even if we don't really understand why it's happening? And it was not a light switch that we flipped on and magically everything felt good. But it was a cultivating of a trust in God. This catapulted us into a season of really understanding the character of God, studying about his sovereignty, about his wisdom, his goodness, his faithfulness, his love. All the attributes of God have to come into play on all of these things if we're going to trust him. And I think we would not know the Lord the way we do today were we not thrust into a position like that to have to.
It strikes me as I'm listening to you and trying to keep formulating good thoughts, because I'm deeply moved as you're talking and deeply edified and challenged as well, as I'm sure many are, that we really do approach God transactionally. We're very much tempted to approach God as if, like we've both been talking about, I do my end of the bargain and then you do yours. And that means that I get what I want, or at the very least, I get a pleasant American existence without a whole lot of bumps and bruises in it. And that's just not what we find in the Old Testament. I don't want to make this now a podcast about preaching in the Old Testament. That'd be a great one to talk with you about. But that's part of why I would just say very quickly, we actually need, as Christians, whatever our doctrinal system is, eschatology, et cetera, and so on, we need to be in the Old Testament, because that's where so many of those saints go through, followers of God, go through that kind of experience. You think about Joseph for 2 years in a dungeon. That's right. That's right. And there's that's like not a throwaway comment, but that's just a detail in Genesis. And
it takes you 3 seconds to read it, and yet he had to live it every day.
Exactly. I mean, you read that and you go, whoa, 2 years? Like, that's not like 2 hours or 2 days. That's insane. That's right. That's a lot.
It's a lot of time to go, how have I got here? What is going on right now?
Yeah, I've lost the will of God, basically, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm out of God's favor. I'm off the map. The location pin has dropped, and I have no way to get back. But in reality, that's exactly where God wanted Joseph, and that's where God wanted you and your wife.
Well, and that's so, Owen, to that point, this is, as we started to read the Bible again with a whole different set of lenses on, you begin to see this stuff everywhere. Like you said, in the story of Joseph, or even the story of Eli and Samuel, where, the Lord's calling out to Samuel and he thinks it's Eli and he keeps running in there. And Eli's like, finally, just say, speak, Lord, your servant's listening. And the Lord ends up telling Samuel that Eli's sons are going to die. And the next morning, Eli asks, what did he say? Don't withhold anything from me. And I've never forgotten this. When Samuel tells Eli what the Lord said and revealed, Eli's response, though I'm sure he had lots of questions, maybe fear, maybe anger, maybe lots of grief and sadness about what he heard, his response was, "It is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him." And as you read the scriptures and you see people experience suffering, you see the 3 Hebrew boys, you see Joseph, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. It is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him. I begin to be confronted with the fact that I didn't have that kind of posture. Whatever got them there, I was not there. And I knew that's where I wanted to be. And so that you start seeing the scriptures paint a very different picture, maybe than what we have thought or viewed before, until all of a sudden you're suffering and you're realizing, oh, it may be the will of the Lord that I'm here. It may be that God absolutely has purpose and plans in this, even if he doesn't tell me what those are, even if he doesn't show me. You think about that story of Joseph. Joseph's whole reason for suffering is that God's going to use him to spare his people from dying of famine, because God keeps his promises and they can't die of famine and God be a keeper of promises. And so Joseph's going to go through the suffering and get there. And remember when Jacob is later summoned to go to Egypt with Joseph and his brothers, and he's hesitant. He's hesitant, and the Lord tells him, "Don't be afraid. I'll build you into a great people there, and then I will bring you back." And if you think about the context of that, when they go into Egypt, Jacob's family is 70 people. When they come out of Egypt, hundreds of years later, they come out numbering 600,000 men, not including women and children. So millions. And the fulfillment of God's promise of "I will build you into a great people" is through suffering.
Mm-hmm. Sheesh. What would you say? That's strong, bro. That's very strong. I want to pick back up with your family story in just a second. Given this harvest of biblical truth and your own personal experience in these deep waters that we're talking about, everyone has their own story, their own, allotment from God. So it's not all the same.
Correct.
But what would you say to the person who's listening to us talk about these things and frankly is in the waters, or to switch the metaphor, has lost the pin and is off the map, and they feel like they are out of the will of God, and they don't know how to get back on the map? What would you say to them out of the overflow of your experience?
Yeah. So Proverbs 3:5-6 says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight." That command, that exhortation, trust in the Lord with all your heart, is followed by a contrast, and do not lean on your own understanding. And I would just say that people may find themselves in a place they never dreamed they would be. They're trying to make their way through the fog. They can't see their hand in front of their face. It feels so disorienting because of things they're going through, because of how circumstances in life have led them to a place they never imagined that they'd be. And I would just say this, trust in the Lord doesn't mean that you understand everything. In fact, that's one of the contrast says, do not lean on your own understanding. The exhortation that we're given is, in all your ways, acknowledge him. The root word there is to know, right? The root word in acknowledgement is know him. In all your ways, know him. Know who God is, right? Know him and his character. And trust that he will make your path straight. That's the only promise given in those exhortations. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge him. And here's the promise. He will make your path straight. He will get the pin. He will move the pin where he wants to put the pin. You're not lost, but you need to trust where the Lord has you. And I think so much of our feelings of disoriented are just recognizing we don't control things. It disorients us to realize we're not in control. When the plan is not going the way we thought, it's not because it's not going according to God's plan. It's because that we don't feel like we have a hold of it anymore. And I can't fix my son, and I can't fix this marriage, and I can't fix this health issue, and I can't fix, and it forces us to open-handedly have to depend on God in ways that, quite frankly, we'd rather be depending on ourselves. We'd rather be We'd rather have nice, clean circumstances and trust God with the little things. And leaning on our own understanding means you're not supposed to wait until you get what God's doing before you trust him with everything. You don't have to know. Joseph doesn't know how this is all going to end. He's in prison and he's trusting the Lord. He doesn't know he's about to end up in the position he's going to be in. We get the benefit of seeing the whole story. Joseph still is sitting in that prison every day. He doesn't see the whole story. So he's trusting. And that's what we're called to do as well. That's what Paul does after Jesus tells him, yeah, I know you've asked 3 times for this thorn in the flesh to be gone, but here's my answer to you. I'm not going to take you out of it. I'm going to sustain you in it. I'll be enough for you. I'm going to give you all sufficient grace for your hour of need. So keep trusting me. And that has to be enough for us. That has to be enough for us. And that is a way by which our maturity is gauged. Is it enough for us, or are we only good with God when we have the circumstances we want?
Wow. Those are some deep and inspiring reflections, honestly. And I'm guessing those are going to land with a good number of folks because we're in hard times. I was just talking with another pastor, Nate Pickowitz, about just the challenging circumstances lots of people find themselves in. The world has been fallen since the garden. So it's not to say, we're in a especially fallen context that we've never been in. But in civilizational terms in America, late 2023, things do feel pretty challenging on a day by day, hour by hour basis, I would say, for a lot of people. A lot of people are right where we are talking about. So I'm thankful for that harvest of wisdom you're offering us here. And I can tell the Lord really has poured into you and you're pouring out in this season. But I know that all of that has come at a cost because there is picking back up with Caleb's story, suffering in his life unto his death. So can you tell us how things went in that phase and how that was?
Yes. So when Caleb was 13, this was in the fall of 2017, he got sick and we went to the hospital to figure out, what was going on. Of course, this was not new for us. Going to the hospital was a very common thing. And on this particular visit, he continued to get worse. They were running tests. They couldn't figure out what was happening. And he eventually went into a coma. And as they finally did some more testing, they discovered that he had something called fungal meningitis. And essentially, he probably breathed something in that, again, your immune system and mine would have immediately just suppressed it and shut it down. His did not, because his immune system itself was suppressed and lowered for his kidney. And so he ended up having a stroke as a result of being with this meningitis. It was in the brain, the spinal column. And we were in the hospital for about 3 to 4 months with him, recovering from the meningitis. But the stroke just left devastating effects on him. He couldn't speak anymore. He was cognitively there. He was conscious. I could make dumb dad jokes and he would laugh and give, he would smile. And, so he was there, but his motor skills had been wiped out. And so a kid that was 13 years old and playing video games with his friends online and going to school and, all of a sudden he couldn't hold a controller in his hand. And we went through a lot of rehab. He went to Atlanta for 3 weeks to an inpatient rehab, and then he did rehab afterwards. But he started dealing with the side effects of that stroke, and he would have neurological pains that would come, and he regressed from all the progress that he had made to eventually to the point where he just had to be carried, put in a chair, and put back in his bed, and it was around-the-clock care. And the result of this was he lost his ability to do things like coughing on command, right? If you felt like your chest was congested, I could say, "Hey, Owen, cough." And you could do that just like that. He couldn't do that anymore. All the things that would make in his brain for him to fire off that command couldn't do it. And the result of that is he dealt with really bad respiratory issues. And eventually, November 2019, we went into the hospital for some respiratory problems. And he never recovered. And that's eventually how he passed away. He had respiratory failure. His lungs just were too sick and they couldn't recover. And so he passed away December 1st of 2019 on a Sunday. And, we always knew that it was a possibility. I mean, from the time his kidneys were removed, we knew there was a real possibility of a lifetime of issues that could shorten his life. But when we went into the hospital that November, that wasn't on our radar. We had been so many times that we thought, we'll get antibiotics, we'll get better, we'll go home. And so when we finally were confronted with the reality that there wasn't going to be a getting better, theologically, we were in a solid foundational place in our lives where we were as steady as you can be in that moment. But there's nothing that prepares you for the weight of that loss. I have described that to friends with an analogy of like squatting, like lifting weights. I could describe to you what it feels like to get under a bar with a lot of weight on it. I could talk about how you're going to feel that weight in your neck and in your shoulders, and it's going to run down your legs. And when you start to bend and squat, you're going to feel it running down your back. And I could describe it, and you can get a sense of it. But it's not the same thing as being under the bar. And that weight of his loss and his just being gone from our lives was hard. It was heavy, and that's what love does, right? I mean, when you love someone, that's what it feels like. And with your child, there's a piece of you that's just so broken. And so learning how to grieve in a way that honors the Lord and trusts the Lord and clings to his promises. We were kind of thrust into a new place with his passing that was different than, it was different than before. And yet still every bit the task was, will I trust? Am I going to hang on to God and trust his promises?
So, Erik, it strikes me in listening to all of this, and thank you so much for sharing it. And I'm just grateful for you doing that. I'm sure it's not easy, but we really appreciate you doing so. It strikes me just one reflection before we conclude here. As a man who wants to be strong in an appropriately biblical way, I see that in your ministry, that's in my ministry by the working of God. A lot of what we try to help young men see is they got to step up, they got to take dominion, they got to get stuff done, leaning on God all the way in much prayer and these sorts of things. This isn't an episode dedicated only to men by any stretch, but just in terms of application, a lot of what you actually had to do in that whole season, it strikes me, as a strong man, is not actually push the right buttons or get the right plan or all these. I'm sure you had to do some of that. You had to actually shepherd your family through a whole lot of weakness and suffering.
Yep.
Is that accurate, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So a big piece of what my role was from the moment it all went down, in 2004, from his death and even beyond his death, has been trying to lead my wife well, loving her as she grieves, teaching her as we're learning together to trust God. And then my children, my girls who were born after Caleb, also teaching them about suffering. I mean, Caleb, and even teaching Caleb about suffering. Caleb understood suffering. Caleb understood God's plan in his life. Like my son taught me, ultimately by the way he lived out his faith in the sovereignty of God and for God's will in his life, than my just teaching it to him. He taught me a lot in how he actually faithfully lived it. But we had to teach him. And part of my job as a father was preparing my son to trust God even in his dying, and trusting being there with my girls. They were holding their brother's hand when he died, leading my girls through this. So there was a lot of leading while at the same time trying to lead myself to respond the right way. And so as a man, I couldn't just isolate myself and grieve. I had to grieve and seek to trust the Lord while trying to also keep an arm around my family doing the same thing. And even since then, it's just continued to be that way. By the grace of God, my marriage has been stronger than ever before. And our kids love the Lord, and our whole family has been sustained by the grace of Christ in our suffering and in our grief and in our loss. But it's not being passive. I would just say as men, we can't be passive in that. We have to take lead. And part of that was just learning to sense from the Lord, like, when my wife is crying and grieving on a day where I'm not feeling, I'm not where she's at, how do I manage that, right? Or how do I manage a day where I am really hurting and my wife seems to be doing okay? Do I bring her into my grief and tip her over and upset her? And look, there's no playbook for that. That's just going, Lord, help me to know what to do. Help me to know what to do here. So there's been a lot of that, but I think depending on the Lord, seeking the Lord, and taking responsibility for, I can't just let them do them. I have to find a way to help them walk through this.
Yeah, that's really helpful. We got to wrap in just a minute here. There's so much I could talk with you about, and I hope you'll come back on Grace and Truth, and we'll talk about more if you'd be so kind in the future.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Probably not Christmas season, but we'll suffice with one here. But in future days, we'll do that. But I would love for you to just say a quick word there in terms of what you were talking about with practical handling of grief. Again, this isn't a podcast aimed at men alone. So all Christians, let's say there's families out there listening to this, watching this, who are walking through or have walked through something like you're talking about. I'm guessing there's a ton of practical wisdom you could share. But you strike me, I'll just say this to sharpen the question. You strike me as having a really honest approach to things where you don't try to hide the grief and pretend like everything's perfect and you never miss him, with celebrating his life and the time you had.
Yep.
How have you managed, if I'm correct, and I may not be, how have you managed to find that healthy balance of grief and celebration and honesty?
I think the one thing is that we don't pretend as if his death is not painful. We don't simply go into Christian lingo and just say, well, we know he's in a better place. And it's like, yeah, we know he's with the Lord and we know he's not sick and dealing with all those issues, but it's okay for us to say this hurts and death is awful. And, we grieve the fact that death is not yet ultimately defeated, but we know it's going to be. And I think it's okay to say both things. I think it's okay to say we're hoping in the promises of God, we're trusting Christ, and we hate death. And we hate what this broken world brings about as a result of it. And yet, God is good. God is in it. God is redeeming all things. And one day, all things will be made new. I think you have to balance those things. We don't want to drive off into the ditch of despair, because that's why, 1 Thessalonians says, we do not grieve as those without hope. We grieve, though, right? We grieve, though. It's just not despair. It's not hopeless grief. When Paul says, I do not consider these present afflictions worth comparing to the glory that will be revealed, he's not saying that these present sufferings aren't real. He's not even saying that they're not real suffering. He's saying they're not measurable. They're not comparable by measuring them against each other, because the glory that's coming will far surpass the grief that we really do have. But it's just that we keep our eyes on what we have coming. And I think that's the balance, that we don't want to live as if we don't hurt when things really hurt. And as a pastor, I've had to be very honest about this with my church. I've had to lead through this with them as well, and be honest about our grief and our pain, and yet try to do it in such a way that grounds and anchors them to the hope in Christ that we have.
Well, one of the things God does in these terrible trials is he takes somebody through very deep waters, and then he brings them back to the rest of us. And I don't mean it's a mere functional outcome, but that is part of what happens is some people are called, some men and women are called to go to the places that every father and mother, fears they'll have to go to. Many do not, but some do go there. But then they come back, they double back through the valley of the shadow of death, and they tell the rest of us, you can make it through Christ.
That's right.
You're going to be okay. And that is,
That's exactly
I see
right.
such a strength in your faith, and I'm deeply edified even right now. So.
Yeah, Owen, one of the things that we say to people is like, listen, we've been through every parent's worst nightmare. And let me tell you, on the other side of it, Jesus is still good. And he will sustain you if you go through the most unthinkable. I can promise you, Christ is greater still.
Amen. Amen. Well, my guest today has been Erik Reed. He's the pastor of the Journey Church in Lebanon, Tennessee. He's got an excellent ministry called Knowing Jesus Ministries. He's given us his time generously today. Erik, thank you so much for being on with me today on Grace and Truth.
Thank you, brother.
And I want to just point everybody as we wrap to the grace and the truth that is in Christ Jesus, John 1:17. There really is tremendous hope, tremendous mercy, tremendous power, whatever you are going through. It's not in a feeling. It's not in a pill. It's not in a program. It's in Jesus Christ. It's in a person, crucified and resurrected Savior and Lord Jesus Christ. That's where hope is found. So God bless you as we conclude.